Welcome to the Weaver's Way. Hi friends, and welcome to the Weaver's Way. For my first video on this channel, I wanted to take a first stab at least, giving you an overview of the decks that I use as a part of my regular spiritual practice. For those of you that know me off of this channel, specifically through Jessica and the Moon and my work there as the community weaver and as a member of the Moonwise membership, you'll know that I'm American. I practice a bit of an American eclectic folk practice, and that ancestor work is a fundamental and foundational part of my practice. And so I thought it might be helpful if I just started by showing you the decks that I use all the time, so that you have a sense of what that looks like for my practice and how I'm using these decks. So without further ado, let's dive in. So most of you will know that my ancestor practice is pretty foundational, as I mentioned. And so the Unfolding Path Tarot is the one that my grandmother and I'm assuming some of my other female lineage ancestors chose as the deck to communicate with me in our work together. And so what's interesting to me is this is a very diverse deck, as you'll see. Let me flip through some of the images for you. But what didn't surprise me is that the backs of these decks have these beautiful peony, I think those are peony, backgrounds. And then the artwork itself is very, I think, pretty feminine. And so while my grandmother and my ancestors were not very overly feminine, there's this softness to it that I think I associate with my ancestors in a way that other decks would not have accomplished. And so it's not really super surprising to me once, I kind of asked, what deck would you like me to use in our work together, as I really was digging in more deeply to my practice. I hadn't been using a deck up to that point, and almost immediately this deck came to mind. I had just gotten it, and maybe like 2 months prior. I hadn't really used it that much, and then look at this death card. And then instantaneously this deck came to mind, and the very first time that I used it, my significator card came up in a position that it was very clear to me that they wanted me to use this deck, and specifically my grandmother. And so I use this deck every day. It sits on my ancestor altar in front of my grandmother's placement, and I work with this deck every single day with her specifically. And I use it anytime except for Samhain practices. I sometimes use other decks for that, but pretty much year round, when I'm doing any big ancestor work that I also need tarot for, I'm using this deck. Look at this. Is that not so beautiful for the Fool? And this Judgment card is just breathtaking. All the air in my astrology chart is loving that Judgment card. But as you can see, it's quite colorful, it's quite diverse, and I think it just really meets a big need in my practice with my ancestors, both for clarity, but for movement. And there's just this, because of the colors and the artwork, an active, not in a busy or frantic way, but a very active engagement with this deck. And so I really feel like these messages, when I get them and I do my daily draw, are directly from my ancestors. And it feels very connected and engaging when I work with it. This Moon card is absolutely stunning. Anyway, so that is the Unfolding Path Tarot, and I use it in my daily work with my ancestors. As most of you know who are part of the Jessica and the Moon Moonwise community, you also know that I work with Brigid. I have her figure here from Molly Reamer at Brigid's Grove. And so my Brigid practice is a fundamental part of my spiritual practice and learning. And so my Brigid practice is a fundamental part of my spiritual practice, and learning and engaging more with Celtic paganism and witchcraft is also a part of my practice. And so part of that work that I'm doing, excuse me, is connecting with that energy and finding a place in my daily rhythms that I can really connect with Goddess, with Brigid, and enter into a space where it is both mundane and magical at the same time, and bringing me into this. I feel like Brigid is such a practical goddess, and so this deck being very earthy and I don't know, there's just not a lot of like vagueness and esotericism that gets really abstract. Like sometimes when you're like, what are you trying to say here? There's not that in this deck. So this is tarot of the Wildwood tarot, excuse me. And so most of you, this is not a new deck at all, and the community, tarot community is very familiar with this deck. And this is the one that Brigid picked. Of all the decks that I have, I kind of opened it up and said, what would you like? And so at least for now, this is the tarot that Brigid has chosen in our work together. And so I do pull a card daily to receive a message from her. The main thing to know about this deck is it does deviate a little bit in renaming the majors and the minor suits. And there are a few depictions that I would say do deviate from the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith meanings as well. And there's also a fair amount of like eco-environmentalism language coded into that, which I personally don't have a problem with. I very much agree with taking better care of the earth as our home and a fundamental part of who we are. That doesn't bother me, but there are a few people I've read in reviews of this deck that have a problem with that. So just be mindful that there is some of that coded into the guidebook. And so if that bothers you, this may not be the deck for you. But for me, it works perfectly in capturing the way that I like look at this Four of Wands, Four of Bows in this deck, but it's Four of Wands. And so it captures that fiery energy so very well. I may do a video later about the decks that I use in my work with Brigid. There are a couple of tarot, but mostly oracles. But I feel like this deck definitely captures some of that Irish and Celtic energy. And as I learn more about Irish paganism and connect more with that aspect of my practice, I feel like this deck definitely supports my work with Brigid. So that's the Wildwood Tarot, and I use it daily. Another deck that I use mostly daily is the Goddess Love Oracle. And I'm forgetting their name right now. I think their first name is Wendy. I've misplaced the guidebook. I got all these decks together and then I made a bit of a mess and now I can't find my guidebook. So hopefully when I clean up, I will find it. But I use this deck for daily draws, or almost daily draws. When I go to my goddess altar, I have kind of like a general divine feminine goddess altar that's not dedicated to a specific goddess. And I will do a few readings and pull a few cards. And this is the deck that from the very first day that I got it has had a special place on my altar there. And so there's a keyword, a phrase below it, and then you can check the guidebook for the number there to find the write-up. Excuse me. And so there are a few different goddesses from different pantheons that are directly referenced. For example, there's Lakshmi here. Brigid is referenced here. Oh, isn't this beautiful? There are a few Norse goddesses and things like that. Here's Ellen of the Way, Huan Yin. But I feel like overall, there's just a general goddess energy. Obviously, Brigid is actually depicted on like 3 or 4 cards here, and I decided to use them for my words of the year and doing it in quarters. And so enlightenment was my first, which fit perfectly for the winter as well, because it allowed me to step into a place of liminality. Because for me, enlightenment is both the seeking of knowledge and the resting and exploring of knowledge. And so it allowed me to be both active and passive at the same time, in the sense of how I was and exploring of knowledge. And so it allowed me to be both active and passive at the same time, in the sense of how I was approaching knowledge, because I sometimes, having grown up in the West, have a very action oriented concept of knowledge and enlightenment. And so for me, starting the year, it was nice to step into this place of, what do I already know that I can lean into more? And this deck definitely supported that. Here's another Brigid card called Awakening. That is also that is the card that I am about to enter in the month of May. And so this deck, I feel like if you're looking for a gentle way to connect with goddess energy and get direct goddess guidance, this deck is so beautiful and supportive. And it's gentle in a way that I think allows you to access that love component if you are doing deity work and maybe you have some deconstructing or religious trauma that you're working through. This deck is definitely a beautiful bridge into feeling really embodied and connected in your goddess practice, because I feel like it feels very safe. There's definitely a lot of love and compassion and gentleness imbued in this deck. And so for me, this was the perfect way for me to start to connect with what would it look like to work with the divine feminine that isn't coded and subservient or discarded to masculine religiosity. I'm gonna butcher that word, but just that so many of the Western religions and Eastern religions, for that fact, are coded to maleness. And so what would it look like for me to develop a divine feminine practice where the divine feminine is the foundational baseline for me? And that has worked. It really fits for me personally. And this deck was an instrumental part in softening me to that idea and helping me to deconstruct a lot of the patriarchal BS that was holding me back from stepping into this. And I can't thank this deck enough. The creator did such an amazing job with it. Another deck that is really instrumental in my monthly rhythms is the Moon deck. This is my card for this month, but I pull a card from this deck once a month, not always on the new moon, but often on the new moon. And this deck is by Aarona, I think that's how you say her name. But this deck is very gentle. It's a little bit more mystical than witchy or pagan per se. But I really love the messages, the imagery, and the write-ups in the book are very supportive. And so for me, I feel like at the new moon, when I'm trying to tap into more gentle energy and what's ahead for me, this deck does a great job of that. And for me, I also don't record these in my journal. This is one of the few decks I just sit with the message of the new moon and ask myself, what is the message that Goddess sends me? And how can I soften into receiving that? And so this deck is that perfect softness for me. And I love that there's a little phrase here that I keep it on my altar. I can see it every time I walk by it or engage in altar work for that entire month. And so for me, it's just the perfect addition to this monthly practice that I have. So that is the Moon deck, and it is something I use once a month. Oh gosh, I'm struggling with this very beautiful bag. That's the Moon deck. Okay. Okay, sorry, I had to take a little break to get a sip of coffee. My husband got me this beautiful tarot coffee card mug that I'm loving, so I'll include a picture of it if I can here. And I think that's so cute. So anyway, let's dive back in. Another deck / decks that I use as part of my regular monthly practice is the Seasons of the Witch Oracle series. And so this is a series of 8 decks from Lorraine Anderson and Juliet Diaz that connect to the different points on the wheel of the year. And so there's one for each of those days or seasons, if you will. And so I'm currently working with the Ostara Oracle, and then at Beltane, I will switch over to the Beltane deck. So the imagery is definitely very spring-like for me, because I feel like there's definitely this darkness and lightness in this deck that captures this beautiful spring energy where I live. Like today, for example, it's very overcast, but there's still so much green of the growing and budding plants and trees that it's both light and dark. And I love that aspect of this deck. And so in the Seasons of the Witch, the way I do this is I pull one of the cards from whichever deck is part of that season. When I pull a goddess love oracle card, and I have a little card holder on my altar, and I put them both there, and I try to pull from that daily. I definitely get to that altar 3 to 6 times a week consistently. I say 3 because when I'm sick, I will still go and sit there, even if I don't pull cards. But if I'm healthy and well, I spend probably 5 to 7 days at that altar pulling cards, saying prayers and devotional readings and things like that. And that altar is for my general divine feminine goddess work. And so I really love these decks for that. There's a softness and folksiness of these decks that I love. I don't super resonate with the poetry at the bottom, but that's okay. I just let that go. I read it, I interpret it best I can, and then I read the guidebook. And the guidebook is phenomenal. There's usually rituals and or recipes and meditations and things like that associated with each card. So there's plenty that you can do with these cards. And for me, working with them keeps me in rhythm with the seasons as well. So it's a great component of my seasonal goddess work. So that is the Seasons of the Witch Ostara Oracle card, and I use this as part of my weekly and daily goddess practice. Let's see, where did I leave off? Okay, and then 2 decks that I use for divination. So these are part of sort of like a daily / weekly practice for me, is I use 2 decks. The first of which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, because everybody who knows of tarot at all knows the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery. This was my first Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which is the Centennial edition. And so it's these backs. And so the only thing I don't like about this version of the Rider-Waite-Smith is that the colors are a little muted. But at the time when I was learning, I really resonated with the backs so much more than the plaid of the original deck. And so I just went with it. And you can see this is my learner deck because I took a Sharpie and wrote keywords on there. I was doing Lisa Pepez's Tarot with Training Wheels video series, and on her YouTube channel, she walks you through selecting keywords. And so I use this deck now for divination and in spell work. But I also use it for just daily draws. When I have a question and I really want to tap into a very clear, concise answer, I connect with this deck. Partly because I did choose single or maybe 2 at most keywords for each individual card. So as soon as I see it, I immediately remember the word I chose for that, and it kind of boils it down. Like now I have more layered understandings of these cards, but when I just want a straight give me the answer. I need an answer. And sometimes even for yes or no questions and things like that in my divination, I come back to this deck, partly because I do believe that the accumulated energy associated with the Pixies deck in general and the artwork for these cards has collected a lot of, collective energy for all of us that work with these images. And so part of when I use it in spell work or in other types of my aspects of my practice, I am trying to tap into these archetypes and the power that all of the practitioners who use this imagery have imbued. And so I find it to be quite powerful part of my practice. And I feel like specifically when it comes to spell work, excuse me, these images are so straightforward for me that I can really layer them into a spell with a lot of like accuracy. You know, like if you were to pull up Cunningham's herbal book and look up an herb, you know, sometimes it's in multiple places. For me, these cards are in one place. I mean, there's definitely nuances there, but when I'm using them in spell work, they are very targeted. If I'm using the magician, it's specifically because I want to manifest something and act as a conduit from divine um, influence and bring that manifest down into my real world. And so, like as an example, so if I were to say be doing an abundance or money spell or a manifestation spell, I would use this card because I believe it to be not only a powerful card, but a precise card for the use that I'm using it for. And so I rely heavily on this deck for that purpose. The Tower card being one that's often used. If you're doing any baneful work, I hear folks talking about that often as a way to cause abrupt change in a situation with someone. And so, but for me, I love the Star card for spell work, and and then the Ace of Pentacles is lovely for some abundance magic. But anyway, this is familiar imagery, so I won't belabor this point, but I use the Rider-Waite Smith. And I think technically this is the Smith-Waite, but I use this deck often. It wasn't my first deck, however, and for that, I want to show you the Lightseers Tarot, because this is my first deck. It is also the deck that I come back to regularly for divination. And I don't use it as much. I started using this deck for daily draws, where I would draw 3 cards every day for 2 years or so. And I kept very detailed notes and journal entries about this deck and about my readings, and I loved it. It was super foundational in my tarot learning process. But I would also say that now, because of that relationship I have with this deck, I don't use it so much as that workhorse daily draw deck. I use it more when I need a trusted friend to give me direct, specific, and kind and compassionate information, whether it's guidance on a situation I'm facing or a hard truth that I need to accept or explore. I come to this deck. So in a lot of ways, this deck is an old friend, even though it's not an old deck. It is an old friend to me. So this Queen of Pentacles gives me life. I just absolutely adore this card. The Star card in this deck is also a favorite, as well as the Three of Cups. I'll show those when we get to them. But I love this deck. And in retrospect, now that I have more decks, as I said, this was my first. Oh, this Tower card absolutely obliterates me every time I see this, because my heart hurts to watch these butterflies being blasted and just vaporized. It just evokes so much in me. Excuse me, but this deck was my first, and to be honest, I think that I fell in love with tarot in part because of this deck. I read from it immediately the very first day I had it. I connected with it immediately. This guy actually looks like a friend of ours. And so immediately I saw myself and others in this deck. I saw my life in a lot of these images. And so it was very powerful for me. So here's the Star card I was talking about, and this tether to hope, to the cosmos, to just this idea that there is a divine plan, not necessarily in a fatalistic way, but that we're tapping into the goodness of life as a sense of hope. And I know there's more layers to this, and if you have Chris Ann's Lightseers Tarot book, the expanded book, she goes into all of the different aspects and images of the images, but I really just love it so much. Let's see, the Queen of Swords, I will point out here, I love and slightly don't love this card at the same time. I've thought about this card a lot because the Queen of Swords is a significator card for me. And I love that she's thoughtful. I love that she's being very reflective. And you can tell that with one hand on the sword, she is prepared to be honest and forthright and decisive when need be, but she's taking the time to pause and reflect, which I feel like is very Queen of Swords coded. But the one thing I kind of struggle with is this idea that the cups are locked up in this little cage. Because for me, the Queen of Swords is not emotionally trapped. She is not emotionally devoid. And I feel like there's a lot of stigma in the tarot community around the Queen of Swords energy that she can be cold and ruthless. And I don't find that, not only for myself as one of my significators, but also this idea that being analytical and strategic in the way that the swords are inherently makes you incompassionate. And I don't believe that to be true. I feel like the swords call us into using intellect as a way to explore feelings and to understand our feelings with greater clarity. And so for me, it's not that the feelings are locked up, it's that the Queen of Swords calls us into mature reflection on our feelings. So for me, if I were to redraw this card, I would have the cup here, out of the cage, and her maybe peering on it reflectively. What are these feelings? What can they teach me? How can I understand myself and the world around me and my lived experiences better because I use my intellect to reflect on my feelings? Because I feel like you can't have one or the other. And this, those of you that know me well know my Libra energy is coming through here, but we can't have one or the other. The mind and the body and emotions must all work together to inform the choices we make when we're in alignment. And so for me, we don't lock our emotions away when we use our intellect. We use our intellect to help clarify our feelings and to help us make wise decisions, but we don't lock them away. And to me, a mature Queen of Swords, as a card that is mature and evolved from our page energy, would know that and would be doing that. And so that's the only change I would make to this card. Anyway, I won't belabor that. I'm sure I could do a whole video just on individual cards within each of these decks. But here I also wanted to point out the Three of Cups because it takes my breath away every time I see it. It makes me feel like I want to gather all my friends and go look at the stars in beautiful dresses and eat lovely food and just spend all day hanging out under the stars. And I feel like this card is so evocative of that. This Hierophant too. Oh. So anyway, I love this deck. I come to this deck often for guidance, like an old friend. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time with this deck in the 2 or so years that I was doing daily readings. And so I would spend about an hour or so doing a reading, reflecting, reading the book. At the time, the little book was all I had. And so I just spent a lot of time with the imagery and the symbols here and reflecting on the energy as I was trying to learn. And this deck is definitely like a big sister deck to me, or like a friend who's just a few years older, in the sense that there's wisdom. And Chris-Anne did such a beautiful job in layering the wisdom into a modern context. Oh my gosh, this Moon card, I remember being just struck in awe of this card when I first saw it. It's such a beautiful understanding of moon energy and the moon archetype within the tarot. Oh, just, she looks so peaceful as she floats there, right? I mean, and I am terrified of deep water, so this idea that she's just so peaceful as she's floating to the bottom of this deep ocean. But it, that's a wonderful shadow I was able to explore as I interacted with this card and this imagery. So, there's a lot here in this deck, and I definitely feel like if you have the extended guidebook and you read through that, you will see even more, and it's just such a beautiful deck. All right, I could belabor this more, but I won't. Let's wrap up. This is the Light Seers Tarot. I am the Weaver's Way, and these are the decks that shape my practice. Have a great day.